At the end of the 19th century, most of the world had been explored by the Western world. The last two fronts were the North and the South Pole. A group of Swedish intellectuals came together to plan an expedition to the North Pole via a hydrogen balloon. No one had attempted such a feat, nor did anyone after. In their hubris, these men thought they discovered a new mode of exploration transport. But they were very wrong. Born on the 18th of October 1854, Salomon Andree was born in Gränna, Sweden. As a young man, Andree attended the Royal Institute of Technology and graduated with a degree in mechanical engineering in 1874. In 1876, he attended the Centennial Exposition, a large scientific fair in Philadelphia. While he was there, employed as a janitor, he met John Wise. They both had an interest in ballooning, and John happened to be a balloonist. In 1882, Andree participated in an expedition to Spitsbergen, an archipelago in northern Norway. He was in charge of taking scientific measurements such as air electricity and conduction of heat. All of this to say that Andree was a liberal man of science. As mentioned before, most of the world has been discovered at this point. The North and South Poles were difficult to explore. Traveling horizontally is always easier. Relative climates, consistency in temperature, and more navigable terrain. While vertical travel was more difficult. To travel from pole through equator to pole would be extremely taxing due to the change of extreme cold to scorching hot, then back to cold. Even more shocking is that at this time, the West did not understand how cold could get. These men would be the first of many to teach the Western world this lesson. The second half of the 19th century was a time full of wonders. The popularity of hot air balloons, the new inventions of the Industrial Revolution, and the blank spots on the map filling up year by year. To the Victorian age, this was a time of radical thoughts. Anything was possible, while at the same time the affluent singularly around the world to press their people in a number of different ways. Man has finally found themselves capable of flight, a luxury that did not discriminate. A truly inspiring time. Inspiring enough that these three men came up with the plan to fly a hydrogen balloon to the North Pole in the name of Old Sweden. Andree began working for the Swedish Patent Office in 1885, another connection he needed to successfully complete his mission. Acknowledging Andree's experience, the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, King Oscar II, and a Alfred Nobel, a Nobel philanthropist who established the Nobel Prize, all helped fund the very popular expedition. The news of this spread worldwide. This would be the defining moment of the heroic age of exploration. To travel from Sweden to the North Pole, then from the pole to Canada or Russia, it was genius. Fly right over the top of the world, or so they thought. So who were the newly famous men? Andree has already been discussed. The other two men were Knut Fraenkel and Nils Strindberg. It was quite difficult to find the backstory of Knut Fraenkel in English. Only after scrolling through many Google pages, and after translating the entire article from Swedish to English, I was able to find more information about Fraenkel. Knut Fraenkel was born on February 14, 1870, in Karlstad, Sweden. Ever since Fraenkel was a child, he loved the outdoors and the topic of natural science. He was a talented gymnast, mountaineer, and an advanced landscape painter. Hobbies he continued into his adulthood, a useful set of skills for the expedition. He was also a major for the Road and Waterway Construction Service Corps, which means that he was a military reserve personnel who was specially trained in the field of civil engineering. He gained the education for this role by receiving a degree from the Royal Institute of Technology in 1896. a man named Niels Ekholm participated in the preparations of the expedition, but dropped out towards the final days. Thus, Fraenkel was given the opportunity to enter the reserves again or take on this expedition with Andree. He chose the latter, thus making him the muscles of the expedition. Now, the third and final man on the expedition was Nils Strindberg. Strindberg was born September 4th, 1872 in Stockholm, Sweden. He came from an artistically inclined family, from which he inherited his artistic ability as well. His younger brother Tor was a sculptor. His father's cousin, August Strindberg, was a famous playwright and novelist. Strindberg was educated as well, receiving a Bachelor's of Art at the Uppsala University in 1893, and a few short years later, also began to lecture a few classes at Stockholm University. In the spring of 1896, Strindberg traveled to Paris to begin his study of gas balloon flight. Later in October of 1896, Strindberg proposed to Anna Charlier, a Swedish woman he met and fell in love with upon returning from Paris. The pair were deeply in love, and his vast knowledge of math, chemistry, and astronomy, Andree found the young man through his connections and wanted to appoint Strindberg as the second in command, the person who would take over if Andree ever became inept for leadership. The engineer Andree wanted to let the wind propel a hydrogen balloon across the Arctic Sea to the Bering Strait, to land in Alaska, Canada, or Russia, while passing over the North Pole on the way. As mentioned before, one man was already dropped out of the mission due to the logistics. Yet another, Fraenkel, took his place. Andree purchased a balloon named Svea in order to practice his balloon flight skills. Surprisingly, Andree was not as skilled as he thought, and his practice flights were not successful. During a few of the Svea's first flights, Andree tried the drag rope steering technique. Long ropes with sandbags attached to them at the ends would hang from the balloons. These ropes dragging on the water or ground would help the balloon steer, as well as slowing the balloon slower than the wind so the wind could blow the ice off the balloon. This was a technique developed by Andree, and modern balloonists reject the theory. The ropes are prone to snagging or falling off, and the math isn't logical to modern knowledge. Andree made 9 journeys with Svea. Most trips on the balloon would carry him way off course into the Baltic Sea. He would be dragged along the surface of the frenzied water, often being slammed into the rocky shoals, severely damaging his basket. Everything would have told him that he wasn't the man for this mission, and that his theory wasn't plausible, but he was determined. And he was sure of his plan. Strindberg, however, had doubts about the trip. Ekholm, a climate researcher, had no doubt that it was possible for the balloon to fly to the pole, but it's just not likely to him. Andree basically expected the northern winds to carry him to the pole due to the poor steering technique he invented. He would drop a buoy with the message at the North Pole, claiming the area in the name of Sweden. Also, Ekholm noticed that the balloon could not retain its hydrogen. This could be from the over 8 million tiny sewing stitch holes in the balloon. No matter how much glue or extra silk they added, it leaked. The 1896 expedition was called off, and the hype around the expedition declined. Andree knew this was only a minor setback, and he picked up Fraenkel and began to plan for 1897. Fraenkel took over the duty as meteorologist and as the muscles of the group. Strindberg, second in command and professional photographer. Then Andree, the leading man and engineer. The team was finalized, plans redone, and the second attempt approaching. Not everyone was on board. Strindberg was worried about the trip again. He greatly doubted the leadership of Andree. Everything Ekholm said made sense. Also, he had a fiancée back at home waiting for him. Yet he didn't reveal this to anyone but his fiancée. The team came back to the Danes Islands in the summer of 1897. The hangar they used in the previous year was still there, albeit a little weathered. Andree also found that the winds were even more favorable than the year before. They would carry him northeast, right to the pole, and the Americas or Russia. Their basket had more space than you think. The basket was divided into two. There was a bottom portion where the men could sleep, and on top of that was an open air portion, still guarded by the basket walls. Not only this, but also the balloon's mouth was rimmed with a circular shelf, so the men also had a storage area inside the balloon. All engineered by Andree and the helping hands of his small support crew that also accompanied the three men to the Danes Islands. Control of this balloon was through Andree's own creation, the aforementioned rope steering. This was the only thing separating the Eagle from an ordinary hydrogen balloon. When the time came to fly on the 11th of July, Andree sent a telegram to the king and to whatever news outlets still wanted to cover the story. The three men climbed into the heavy basket, and Andree gave a speech. Then, support crew cut the balloon free. Instant tragedy struck the balloon. The balloon struck something upon ascent. Most likely said it was the side of the shelter sky opening. The men on the ground heard Andree say, "What's that?" Then the three men ascended a few hundred feet, headed northeast. The steering ropes then dropped. With the bags of sand at the end connecting the balloon to the earth, the support team cheered as they watched their fellow countrymen fly off towards the water and towards glory. The dangling ropes then reached the water. As they dragged, they quickly became tangled, causing the balloon to descend. The sandbags then snapped off due to the friction caused by its lack of dynamics in the water, and the part due to Andree's screw mechanism he implemented. This was to help in the case of a bag being caught on something on land. The men at the shack watched as the three men frantically began to throw a variety of things overboard, an estimated 1,600 pounds. The basket struck the water. They kept throwing and tossing. They even had to toss the replacement bags of sand that they had. The balloon rose from the water surface finally, noting that they were, at this point, a glorified balloon with dangling ropes. Andree made the call to continue and not abort. They continued to bob up and down until the support team on land couldn't see them anymore. After tossing half of their weight, the balloon's bobbing came to a gradual bob. So gradual that the men were able to each make notes in their personal journals. Fraenkel made meteorological notes. Strindberg made astronomical observations, and a shorthand letter to his fiancée Anna. However, Andree had longer and more detailed notes. The first night he wrote, "The snow and the ice, a light, dirty yellow across the great expanses. The fur of the polar bear has the same color." I'm sure the two others were worried at this point, but didn't want Andree to know. They were at the entire mercy of the wind. That night, the wind stopped for around 40 minutes. They began to blow the balloon west instead of east. The next morning, Strindberg writes, "Pleasant feelings prevail." Due to the ropes failing, the misty Arctic air began to cause ice on the balloon. The balloon also began striking the ice at gradual intervals. 8 touches in 30 minutes. Touches every 5 minutes. Basket drags 100 feet on the ice. Nevertheless, Andree writes, "Humor good." He relieved Strindberg and Fraenkel so that they could rest. "Is it not strange to be floating above the polar sea? To be the first to have floated here?" he asks. "How soon will others follow in our footsteps? Is this ambition?" The following evening, Strindberg began to vomit from the constant bobbing and crashing of the balloon. The men dropped more weight and rose once more. Andree mentions in his journal how their progress is quite stately. Later that evening, he also mentions how a polar bear was swimming beneath them, and how the dangling rope scared it away, the bear being just 100 feet beneath them. Early on the 14th, they dropped more weight, and then decided to release the hydrogen and land, because soon the only weight would be themselves left in the basket. They hit the ice sometime later and began to establish a new plan. The men at this point had only traveled for 65 hours and a distance of 517 miles. Not even halfway to the pole. They were defeated. Andree was not one to accept defeat so easily. The northern pole was vastly still undiscovered by science, and any scientific info about the areas would be greatly appreciated by the donors and the wider scientific community. While Andree was figuring out how not to leave empty-handed, the other two men were focused on finding a way home. The team had 3 methods of communication: their journals, homing pigeons, and the buoys. They'd used the buoys as a type of message in a bottle. Only 2 buoys were ever found, and they just gave some coordinates and said how well the journey was going that far. These were dated before the landing, though. Out of all the pigeons released with messages, only 1 was ever retrieved. As well, no messages mentioned any issues, only their journals had mentioned of it. Once they landed on July 14th, they soon realized they were actually floating on a large mass of ice. Strindberg got to work, immediately taking photos. As seen here, the men had to unload the balloon and begin to make camp. Not far north of where they launched, a plan was needed. The balloon shockingly supported their guns, sleds, skis, a tent, and all essential provisions. The men had more provisions stored for them in Franz Josef Land and back at the Svalbard Islands. With the North Pole out of the question, the men began to decide. Cape Flora in Franz Josef Land was chosen even though both depots were equidistant. The Cape Flora depot had more provisions. Thus the men prepared their journey after camping for a week, each man boasting a sled of 500 pounds each. This was too heavy and only broke the sleds and tired the men out. They shortly lightened this load to 300 pounds each after leaving food and other essentials behind. Hunting now became a priority. This, however, would still be a major challenge due to the uneven terrain and 2-story tall ice ridges. By the 22nd of July, they realized that their pace and the ice's flow in the opposite direction was too much of a challenge, so they decided to ride the float. This would take them southwest back towards Svalbard. Their terrain was tough, but the men came across a few patches of open water and converted their sled into a small boat. Things were seeming optimistic for the men. The wind then changed over the next few weeks. The wind changed from southwest to northwest, the wind pushing against them, especially over open water. This was too tough for the men. Svalbard was now out of reach. They decided to make home on the ice floe. The idea wasn't bad because the current was still dragging them south, so they were still on the right track, just not as fast as they would want to be. The floe struck one of the islands of Svalbard, but they were still hundreds of miles from the depot. They made a fort on the ice and made preparations to wait out the winter. A few weeks later in October, the floe began to cleave right under the men's hut. The pressure of the island and the men living on top of the ice floe caused them to move camp onto the island. Andree surprisingly recorded in his journal, "Morale remains good. With such comrades, one should be able to manage under any circumstance." On October 6th, Strindberg wrote snowstorm reconnaissance. Then the word moving in his journal on October 7th. On the 8th, Andree wrote, "It feels fine to be able to sleep on fast land, as a contrast to drifting ice out upon the ocean where we heard the constant winding, cracking, and din. We will have some moving around to do once the weather permits." This weather is thought to have been their doom. For 33 years the expedition was shrouded in mystery. This story became part of Swedish lore, and the disappearance attracted international attention. Surprisingly, the disappearance soon gained more attention than the expedition's launch. As you can imagine, many stories came from the disappearance of the men. A psychic told Swedish reporters that the men were safe. The Russians said that they'd spotted the men in a bar in Siberia. Some ships said they pulled Andree out of the Arctic Ocean. He told the crew that the other two men died, Then he died himself. There were even reports by a ship that 3 men fell from the sky into the ocean and were never retrieved. Anytime an abandoned basket or silk fabric were found randomly, Andree came to mind. Yet modernly, we have found 4 main theories for the end of the expedition. After their camp was discovered in 1930, the scene was eerie. It's believed carbon monoxide poisoning, hypothermia, a polar bear attack, and suicide might have been the end for the men. It's thought carbon monoxide could have been the killer, but their stove wasn't in the shelter, so to have the fumes come into their hut and kill them is unlikely. Hypothermia is plausible due to the recorded storm in their final days. Sometimes hypothermia can affect your mental constitution, causing one to make poor choices. The polar bears have been a great foreshadowing element along the journey. They are the only bear to actively hunt humans. They're huge, and they've been drawn in by the camp's food. Andree also didn't respect nature's Arctic predator and found safety and hubris in a gun. It's believed that Fraenkel and Strindberg were attacked fatally by a bear. Andree had so much respect and need for the men that losing them before a long, isolated winter would have seemed pointless. So it's believed that Andree gave himself an overdose of morphine, which is why he was found sat outside perched on a boulder near camp clutching his gun. The topic of legacy is quite a controversial one. Many blamed Andree for failing all attempts during his test flights, then going ahead anyways, putting all his faith in his steering method and the wind. Also, Andree was pretty much the only balloon enthusiast in all of Sweden. And even then, it was only his hobby, not his profession. He doomed a 25-year-old and a 27-year-old to death due to his insanity. Or was it pride? In hindsight, researchers see that there was an enormous pressure on Andree to make this expedition happen. If he failed, his name would be dragged internationally, and to disappoint the king, who funded him, must have felt like treason. All we have left to tell the story of the men are the journals, the photos, and the testimony of the people who found the campsite. We may never know exactly what happened to the men. By the time they were found, they were pretty decomposed, torn at by vermin, and weathered by the elements. An autopsy would have been impossible. The men were cremated. Strindberg's fiancée had long given up on him being alive. By 1930, she had married and followed her dreams of music and died at an old age of natural causes. Andree's legacy also carries on through the Swedish film The Eagle. There aren't a lot of YouTube videos on the topic of Andree. I'll link a few good videos by other creators in the description. I will be turning 25 this year, and I really felt for Strindberg. I can only imagine what fears he would have had, especially leaving his cherished fiancée behind. I feel as though a small amount of research by the investors would have easily proven that Andree was incapable of the mission and that he was the only Swede ballooning at the time. Countries that did balloon, like Paris and England, never thought of an idea because they're experienced enough to know better. It was only deemed plausible because Andree claimed he invented a steering method. Anyways, I hope you all enjoyed. Please let me know your thoughts on the long form content that I've done here. Leave a like and subscribe to see much more. Thank you and take care.